Hi, I'm Michael Brooks from theelusiveobvious.com, and we're talking today with Hooman Majd. He's the author of The Ayatollah Begs to Differ and The Ayatollah's Democracy, which are two of the most astute, intelligent, informative, and actually really entertaining books about Iran that I've ever come across. And it seems like a really good time to talk to him with all of the things that are going on, both in Iran, between the U.S. and Iran, and with our presidential election and some of the kind of rhetoric that's happening there. Humant, how you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for that lovely introduction.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So I just right off the bat, I want to ask you: you spent a great deal of 2011 in Iran? Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, pretty much most of it. Yeah, most of the year I was there. hmm
So do you hold a dual citizenship?
Yes, yes, I do. Yeah,
Okay.
like many other Iranian Americans, I also have Iranian citizenship. Yes.
So, taking it more on a kind of a ground level, we think of sanctions a lot, just in terms of how it's affecting the kind of the weapons issue, nuclear issue, security, and stuff like that. But how are the sanctions regimes uh, affecting the sort of ordinary Iranian citizen and their kind of economic lives right now?
Well, sanctions always affect the ordinary people in any country where they're applied. No matter what the country that's applying the sanctions says or even intends. The fact of the matter is, as the sanctions have gotten stricter and tighter over the last year, particularly over the last year, there have been unilateral sanctions by the U.S. and by Europe specifically. It's made life difficult for the average citizen, average Iranian citizen, in many different ways. I mean, inflation is one key that you can look at. The inflation rate has always been high in Iran, but now there's inflation on foreign-made goods, obviously, because they're much more difficult to obtain because of the sanctions. Sanctioning the central bank of Iran makes it very difficult for people even small businesses who are involved in the import-export business. How do they get paid, for example, from foreign countries or foreign suppliers?
Right.
Or if they're selling goods to other countries, how do they get paid? These are all issues that become a problem for the average, the average guy who may even have a very small business, even a grocery store where he imports, let's say toothpaste,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. So it's not sanctions don't really haven't really affected the Iranian government yet, and they probably won't in the short term, only because Iran is an oil producing country that has a lot of foreign exchange, and is quite a wealthy country. But yeah, the sanctions are definitely affecting people, ordinary people, and it's making life difficult for them.
So less pleasant for the ordinary Iranian, and not much effect yet on the government.
Yeah, exactly,
Okay.
exactly. I mean, you have to remember that Iran has been under some form of sanction from the West ever since the Iranian Revolution, and this is an ongoing thing. It's just that in the last couple of years they've gotten much tighter and much more difficult. It's been much more. I mean, there was a long time throughout the Islamic Republic's history when the only country applying sanctions to the U.S. To Iran was the U.S. And now it's really kind of all over the place. Most countries are abiding by U.S. sanctions because they want to do business with the U.S. and the U.S. threatens them that if they don't apply sanctions, that they won't be able to do business in the U.S. So it's really becoming difficult for Iran to find friends who will do business with them. Although that said, there still are friends who will do business with them, such as China and
Mm.
Russia.
Hmm. China and Russia. And we all remember the kind of the stolen election in 2009, and the really powerful, just even I think even if you weren't following the story particularly closely, just the powerful images of the kind of people in green on the streets, and the
hmm
images of brutality, and also some of the kind of images of resistance. And I think it had effects on a lot of people in terms of their kind of perceptions of maybe the average Iranian. And then, now, of course, we've had movements across the kind of Arab Middle East. And what's the state of the Green movement or the opposition? And what's a good way of thinking about that? Are the two things the same, or are they a little different?
Well, they're different because what we came to think of as the Green Movement, or what was the Green Movement, doesn't really exist anymore. That was a movement that coalesced around one specific, or in fact, two specific presidential candidates who lost the election and claimed fraudulently lost the election in 2009. And it was an expression of anger on the part of the Iranian people that they came out on the streets. I mean, now in hindsight, when you look at what happened in Iran in 2009, it was, compared to what's been happening in the Arab world, actually quite mild. I don't mean in terms of the number of people who came out in protests, but in terms of the violence on both sides, both on both the side of the protesters in terms of what kind of violence they engaged in, which was very minimal, and on the side of the government, even in terms of the brutality. Not to say that there weren't incidences of incredible brutality, but in terms of like killing, even the opposition claims of the number of dead is less than 100 compared to Syria, for example, or even Tahrir Square, where in 1 week more than that were killed. And this was in Iran. So I think there was a little bit of, I mean, at the time we saw these people who really were objecting to a fraudulent election. A certain number of them certainly objected to the regime as a whole and wanted to see a revolution or to see a complete change. And then there's a large group of people who just want change in Iran. And I think that includes many, many, many of the youth in Iran, who number more than anyone else.
Right.
It's a very young population in Iran, and they definitely want to see change. I don't sense today that there is much of a desire for a revolution. And in a way, looking at what's happened in the Arab countries and the Arab Spring, it's almost like undesirable to have that kind of revolution for many Iranians. They would like to see the change to happen from within. They would like to see reform. They would like to see, in some cases, drastic change, but not necessarily a whole-scale revolution, because a revolution, brings on unknowns. And I don't think Iranians, first of all, many of them still have memories of the Islamic Revolution and the unknown that happened then, and which was they had no idea that what they were revolting for was an Islamic Republic of the form it took.
Right.
And certainly when you look at Egypt and Syria and Libya and places like that, nobody wants a repetition of any of those places. So I think there's a sense that there are things about Iran that need to be changed, specifically by the youth. And then there are things that need to be remain the same. There are still some people who feel that Iran's general foreign policy is good. The policy of being not allied to the West or not allied to the East. So it's a complicated issue. It's not as simple as saying, everybody wants change. Everybody wants to get up and, throw out these dictators. It's not quite as simple as that. It's a pretty complex issue. But there are many, many different groups of people in an opposition, if you want to call it that. And there's some of them are quite conservative, who are in opposition to the status quo. Let's put it that way.
Right. Right. So it's maybe more helpful to think of it as a civil rights movement versus a revolutionary movement.
Well, definitely civil rights movement, and that still exists. There are plenty of people who are still working very hard, actively. Some of them end up in jail, some of them don't, but there are still plenty of people who are working for civil rights and for a more democratic system in Iran. And again, compared to some Arab countries, there is actually still, to this day even, probably more freedom to express views. There are a lot of red lines which one cannot cross, and people end up in jail, unfortunately, when they do cross those red lines. And sometimes the red lines change, which makes it very difficult for civil society to maneuver. But yeah, I would call it more of like a rights movement and a movement to bring about change, rather than to bring about the overthrow, the complete overthrow of a system. Also, when people think in terms of change, they can think, well, yeah, I don't like this regime. I want to see it change. I would rather see it change gradually than overnight, because if it changes overnight, I have no idea who's going to come in, what it's going to be like.
Right.
And if it changes gradually, I might not be completely happy with the first set of changes, but over time, if we all work together, we can get to a democratic system.
And those opposition candidates they were voting for, like Mousavi, that was a vote for that. It was a vote for gradual change within the system.
Well, certainly. Yeah, it was definitely within the system, and it was definitely a change from the more conservative and more hardline President Ahmadinejad, for sure, the people who voted for those people. But what's something we forget here as well is that, and we have tended to forget here as well, that unlike in the Arab countries, President Ahmadinejad and even the system, the regime, the supreme leader, do enjoy quite a bit of support in Iran still to this day. And unlike, Hosni Mubarak, who basically had no support. I mean, if he maybe had 5% of the population, maybe he had 10% of the population, but certainly not 20% or 25%, there wouldn't have been a revolution in Egypt if he had that many people, or at least that many people who would be willing to fight for him. And that's kind of the key here. You have a group of people in Iran, and it's quite a large group. It's not a tiny group. It may not be the majority, who still believe in the system, still believe, and certainly Ahmadinejad has. I mean, even if you would argue that the election in 2009 was completely fraudulent and the results were reversed, that he got 13 million votes and Mousavi got 26 million votes. I mean, 13 million people, even if you accept that figure, 13 million people voting for Ahmadinejad, that's a lot of people, you know?
No, that's
so it's not quite the same. Yeah, and I think we forgot that. We tended to think at the time that, oh God, everybody hates, we see these images of people coming out and protesting. Oh, everybody hates Ahmadinejad. Everybody hates the supreme leader. They want a revolution. They want change. And that was true certainly of the people who came out, that they wanted change, but there were certainly plenty of people who also didn't want change, and makes it very difficult for people who do want change when they're confronted with a rather substantial group of people who in some cases are armed and are willing to die for their cause.
Right. So I want to take a couple of issues and maybe see if we can kind of blend them in a little bit. I think in the States, what we most often think about is the nuclear issue. Mm-hmm. And how is that perceived in Iran? Is that I know, some people talk about Pakistan having the first Islamic bomb as an example. When the average Iranian thinks about acquiring this technology, are they thinking of it in terms of a nationalist Iranian kind of having access to this technology and their rights of Iran? Or are they putting it in this more kind of apocalyptic religious context that is often spoken about in the United States? And then I guess attached to that, when you hear the kind of rhetoric from the presidential candidates about this sort of apocalyptic tendencies of the Iranian leadership, how much does that bear any resemblance to reality in terms of what the leadership's actually up to? Okay.
Not at all. Among the leadership or among the people of Iran, nobody, even the people who hate the regime, nobody believes in that apocalyptic vision for a nuclear Iran. The nuclear program is still quite popular among people. It's technological advancement that any nation would be proud of. And yeah, you look at Pakistan and the Islamic bomb, the Iranians aren't looking at first of all, for those who even think that Iran should have a bomb or will have a bomb, aren't necessarily thinking of it as an Ayatollah's bomb or a Shiite bomb or an Islamic bomb. And nobody is thinking in terms of in apocalyptic terms. I mean, people like to say that here because of some of the things that Ahmadinejad has said. But, Ahmadinejad may believe in the apocalypse. He may believe in the Messiah showing up, on Earth very soon. But it doesn't matter. I mean, first of all, that's rhetoric to a large degree. And secondly, he's not in charge of the nuclear program. The Ayatollahs who do hold the power and are in charge of national security and the nuclear program, they're not suicidal and they're not stupid. They're some of the best survivors around. They've survived a couple of 100 years under difficult circumstances in some cases, with kings who've wanted to, oppress them or suppress their ideas. So they're survivors and they're human beings, and they aren't sitting there waiting for the apocalypse or thinking that they could start an apocalypse. In fact, some Ayatollahs believe that talking about it is anti-Islamic. Talking about the apocalypse and talking about the Messiah returning to Earth is anti-Islamic, and they think that certainly in Islam, there's no human being should be interfering in the work of God. God will decide, not humans, when there should be a new Messiah or a Messiah returning. So no, I mean, that's just nonsense. Nobody in Iran believes that. As I said, not even the most ardent anti-regime activist believes that Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, wants to have a nuclear weapon so he can drop it on Israel and start the apocalypse.
Okay. Well, these are all things that are really valuable to know, that the sanctions are primarily impacting average Iranians right now, that the opposition is maybe more better thought of as kind of an evolutionary civil rights movement. And we could think of the Ayatollahs as kind of potentially cynical, realist actors like most other political heads of state across the world. Hooman Majd, thank you so much for your time. I think this is really informative, and I think it's really important because of just the kind of cartoon version of Iran that's spoken about so much across the country today.
Thanks so much, Michael.